We're still on a crash course to the end of the world, and Season 1 of our Circular Economy podcast didn't fix it. So here we are with the Tech for Good Live Circular Economy podcast Season 2. Will we still be recording this when the tidal waves hit? How many seasons in will we be then? 234 or maybe just 10? Who knows? I'm Bex and Tom Passmore from Disposal is here, and this time we're focusing more on the economy part, which is great because everyone likes money, and that's what the economy is about, right? Welcome back to Tech for Good Live and the Circular Economy Podcast Season 2. This is Episode 2. If you've not listened to the first one, you should go back and listen to it, and also to Season 1. It will all make much more sense, hopefully. In the previous episode, we looked at the biocycle and introduced economics. Now we have a deep dive into aluminium flows. Episode 2. Episode 1 ended really positively. Where are we going this episode, Tom?
So we're going to talk about cars and aluminium. So kind of do like a quick look at that world around kind of recycling aluminium to get cars on the road, and then the role of cars within the circular economy.
Bit of a case study.
Exactly. So I'm not a car person in any way, shape or form. Cars
like a car person, like a transformer. You're literally not a car.
I'm not a car. I am a person, but I don't transform. No, so cars have never interested me. Hold no interest. Going fast, revving engines, that's like all really dull. But I've got really, really excited about cars recently to do with the circular economy. So this idea of transport as a service. So you'll be able to use a lift sharing app to get into a car and drive away. So you don't have to own that service. And the idea of automation as well. So driving in a self-driving car, like sitting in it and just like going places is cool. Like that's a really cool idea. And then like all of this massive push that for some reason, and I have no idea why, cars seem to be at the forefront of it, of all of this. For me, it's really, I don't get it. I don't get that. So I thought, let's go and talk to some people about cars. Why not? So I went to Jaguar Land Rover, as you do, to talk to people about cars.
Yes, so my name is Gaëlle Guillaume, and I am a senior sustainability engineer at Jaguar and Rover. I work on sustainability aluminium projects that aims to work on aluminium recycling. So Jaguar and Rover is Britain's largest auto manufacturer, and they are producing vehicles that are mostly in the premium and luxury segments. And you would have heard from our latest launches, such as the Range Rover Evoque, and also the battery electric vehicle, the Jaguar Ibase, that was released a few months ago.
Do you know anything about the Ibase?
Absolutely nothing.
Neither did I. The Ibase is like Jaguar's electric car. Is it an SUV? I don't even know what an SUV is. It's kind of a... Biggish, yeah. So it's not like massive, but it's kind of big and it's all electric. And so if you think it looks like a Vauxhall Vectra from behind, and but it won a obviously the Vectra was obviously a beautiful car, because it won a design award. So that's really cool. But no, so they have this idea, Jaguar Land Rover.
You really don't know anything about cars.
I know nothing about cars. I know absolutely nothing about cars. It was really, really embarrassing. Sat down in Jaguar Land. I don't even know where it was. And talking to Gail, because she's like brilliant, like really knowledgeable, like really excited about it all. And I was just going, it's cars. But no, so we were talking about this, and it feels like it's such an exciting time for the car industry, because they have to change. They've been pumping out emissions into the atmosphere for close to 100 years, over 100 years since the Model T came out, and really damaging for the environment. Everyone owns one. They're costly, they're expensive, but in a circular economy, to get people around, you need cars. And they're changing, very rapidly. For an industry of its size, they're changing really rapidly. So they've gone from, combustion engines to battery-powered engines in about 10 years. It's a massive overhaul. And then you are looking at automation, and then you're looking at this transport as a service, and I'm like, oh, wow, this is really cool. I know nothing about the thing that it's built on, the car, but the tech feels really cool, and the frameworks around it seem really cool. So talking to Gail about that.
Those are exciting times for the automotive industry. Obviously, there are many challenging upon companies like JLR that are, for example, to reduce the emissions that we do, but great. That means that we have to think about the way we do our cars, which is positive because people like me can start talking about what the circular economy can bring into that equation, and at the same time, the way people will move in the future will also completely change, and that's where automations come into play. That's where the connected technologies with the vehicle environment also comes into play. That's where electrification comes into play. That's where sharing also comes into play. And all those will drive a question about, okay, how does those fit into the circular economy? Are we sure that the way we design our batteries is the best way that we can do in terms of reclaiming what's in there? Do we know the provenance of those materials? So those are also questions that we need to address at the company. For example, in the sharing environment, great, we've put cars on the road, they will stay there for 4 to 5 years. Do we know what we're going to do with those assets when they reach end of life? So that's also a question that we need to answer. As well as for the autonomous capabilities that we are developing for the future vehicles. What does that mean in terms of social impact? But yes, the future of the automotive industry is bright, I believe, and there is a lot of opportunity for future sustainability projects and circular projects to thrive into that environment. So even though there are a lot of challenges to address, that means that there are many more opportunities for us to take in and tackle those challenges as best as we can.
The main reason I went down to speak to Gail and Jaguar Land Rover was kind of what she was mentioning there about like end of life on vehicles. So Jaguar Land Rover are using a lot of aluminium in their cars. Aluminium is like this high value material that's infinitely recyclable. You can keep throwing it around the system time and time and time again. But there's a problem within my industry, within the waste industry. We actually don't handle cars that well. They get to the end of life, pull the wheels off them, turn them into a giant cube, send them overseas. Not the best way of handling a valuable resource like aluminium, especially when there's been so much design and effort gone into it. So is there a way that they can change that? So yeah, we were talking to Gail about that, and they're working on this project called the Reality Project.
So Reality is an Innovate UK funded project where the consortium, so that consists of JLR, so us as a lead partner, Novelis, one of our aluminium supplier, Action, who is also acting in that recycling space as a metal recycler, as well as Norton, who is an aluminium smelter. And we also have the support of Innoval, who is also giving us all their knowledge on the aluminium industry, as well as 2 academic partners, namely Brunel University and Warwick Manufacturing Group. So we are working together to understand if we can use end-of-life vehicles or other aluminium scrap sources to make aluminium alloy grades to be used in JLR vehicles. So as I said before, we are using 5000 series aluminium and 6000 series aluminium. So within those grades, is there a potential for us to tap into that resources that we have in our scrapyards? So end-of-life vehicles are shredded, and then this shredder residue is usually shipped over to other places where it's downgraded to other applications. Potentially, there would be an opportunity for us to use it for automotive components who are an higher-end application for that aluminium scrap. And to do that, once the scrap is being shredded, we need to understand what are the different processes needed in terms of refining that scrap to make sure that all that stays in the end is an aluminium scrap that is of a high enough purity for us to use back into the production of aluminium alloy grades.
I love the idea of a car shredder.
Yeah.
Just imagine a full-size shredder, like with just putting a whole car in there. That could be fun. I'm into that.
Yeah, I think there's actually, you can go on YouTube and look at videos of it. Like,
is that actually what it is? Like, is it you just put like the whole?
Yeah. Like
in?
it's like it is like a giant paper shredder. Like,
I know that's not what I should have taken from that. But
No, it isn't. It isn't. It's fine. No, it's good. It's fine. No, but that is how these really valuable assets are being treated at the moment. And this is the project they're looking into. Like, actually, is this the only way? Hopefully, no.
So don't get rid of the car shredder.
Yeah. Car shredders have rights too. No, but like, and I think it's really interesting, this idea, like, because I've always thought, again, because I know nothing about cars, that's actually what happened to cars anyway. I thought that they'd go to scrap dealers and they just get all taken apart because there's so many value materials in there. And I was wrong. And I was like, that's really interesting. So what can we do? This is why they're doing this reality
taking
project.
Things apart is more difficult than it sounds, though, isn't it? I know that mattresses don't get taken apart because of the amount of time it takes. And there is value in the materials, but it doesn't add up to the amount of time it takes to take them apart.
Yeah.
But aluminium sounds more important than bed springs.
Yeah, no, definitely. Again, it's all important, but let's hit some higher value products. So let's hit aluminium first and try to solve that problem. So I was talking to JLR and they kind of mentioned this other company in there as well called Novelis. So I went to talk to Novelis as well.
My name's Andy Doran. I work for Novelis. My role in Novelis is in sustainability and recycling development. So Novelis is a global aluminium flat rolled products company. So to explain that, we make aluminium sheet, highly engineered for a multiple number of applications, automotive applications, beverage packing applications, and various others. I guess our interest, our sort of driving force in circular economy thinking is around being the world's largest recycler of aluminium. So global footprint, run a number of closed loop systems for taking material from product to product essentially. Generally speaking, have sites that are single largest site for aluminium, but the world's largest buyer of scrap aluminium.
So these are the aluminium people. They're massive, global brand, and working very closely with Jaguar Land Rover to solve this problem around aluminium just going to waste, because it's energy. It takes a huge amount of energy to get it from the earth. So do you know anything about aluminium?
Just like you know nothing about cars, I know nothing about aluminium.
Cool. So aluminium it comes from an ore called bauxite. So you rip out this ore from the planet, you turn that into alumina, and then you smelt that down into aluminium. And then aluminium you use in all of these different products. The key kind of message to take away about aluminium is aluminium's always an alloy. To use it in any kind of product, it has to be an alloy. You have to add other metals in there like copper, or I'm just going to say copper, I don't know the rest. To give it the property it needs. So either to be nicely malleable, or to have strength, or to give it so it doesn't oxidize. You have to add all these different things to it. So even though it's infinitely recyclable, you also have to make sure that it stays segregated with its other alloys, because as soon as you start mixing them together, that's when it gets to just junk. So one of the things I asked Andy was, will we ever get to a point where we won't have to do any mining of bauxite? Will it be 100% recycling for aluminium?
I mean, the ambition of the business is to continue to grow, the amount of scrap, and that's something that we've taken already great steps forward from 2011, where we're at 33%, to that 61% that we're currently at. The challenge with getting to 100% is probably still there for some time. And what I mean by that is we have systems at the moment where we're not recovering 100%. So if you're going to have a 100% recycled system, you need the collection to be 100% perfect. And for example, if you look at beverage cans in the UK market as an example, we recycle really well, 75%. But that still means that on a system level, you're not getting 25% back in. So if you're going to make beverage can sheet, you're going to need 25% of non-recycled inputs to fill that gap. That's one of the issues. I think the other one is markets are growing and continue to grow, because aluminium's properties are bringing it into new areas, but expanding existing areas. Particularly a good example would be automotive, where aluminium's penetration into automotive market is growing and will continue to grow, as I think people are looking at it as a material that can bring lightweighting and the benefits of lightweighting. Things like electrification, etc., is one of the things where people are now saying, well, to extend battery life, technology battery is one thing, but having a lighter chassis, a lighter vehicle helps that battery go further. So you're going to see aluminium continue to grow in certain markets. And again, on a systems level, if your market is growing, you're always going to need to be putting something into it. So 100% is the ultimate goal, if you like, but it might keep moving away from us for a while as the market continues to grow.
What Andy's saying is probably never going to get to 100% fully recycled aluminium streams, like for lots of different reasons. Like it's a growing market, and when it has to be a perfect system to get it back into it. And like Ken was talking about earlier, like they have to be leaky loops. So the idea of leaky loops, they'll go into different systems. So even though they might be perfectly good for different applications, they probably won't be able to use for like beverage can, aluminium grade. So we're always going to have to be extracting bauxite from the ground to be put back into the system. Does that make sense?
It does.
Cool.
Everyone wants aluminium, is what I get out of that.
Everyone wants aluminium because it's a wonder product.
I liked the term lightweighting.
Lightweighting.
Yeah, it's cool.
Like lightweighting cars, yeah. So they are more energy efficient for their batteries. And then the batteries are insanely heavy, so you just instantly lose all that gain. But, you know, what do I know about cars? Literally nothing. As we've already ascertained. But yeah, so one of the questions I asked, like, cool, like this demand for aluminium is constantly increasing. We haven't got a perfect recycling system. Are we going to run out of bauxite?
You know, we're not going to run out of aluminium, theoretically. It's a fairly abundant material.
Oh, really?
As a primary material. The sustainability challenge with the material is the high carbon embedded cost of conversion. So you've got to convert it, and that's where all the energy goes into, and that's why it's quite a carbon rich material from a primary source. So I don't think you're going to run out of the material. You might ration or run out of the energy you needed to convert it. So that's where recycling plays its part. And then, you know, that's where people might start looking at using, you know, the use of that sort of material in short life applications or disposable applications. And, you know, that's where the models are going to have to change really to get aluminium back into that 100% closed loop system.
I think this is really interesting because it was what we were saying in the first episode about, and I know they're not talking about money yet, but it's like that idea of you can't just look at materials in its own thing, in its own bubble. You have to include energy in there, you have to include money in there, you have to include flows in there. And they've become a very complex world of...
Definitely.
Yeah.
Because at first, when, you know, aluminium isn't going to run out, great, make everything out of aluminium then. But actually, the picture's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, like very, very high energy costs to like extracting it and to recycling it as well, aluminium. So yeah, like it was interesting going to talk to Novelis about this because, yes, there's this growing demand for aluminium, and then it is recyclable, but you have to capture it, which then brings its own problems. Then energy problems come into it. So again, this like wicked problem is starting to emerge, which I do think like it's fascinating. But yeah, I wanted to kind of understand how the project was going with like both JLR and Novelis. So I was asking them about their relationship there.
Our relationship with Jaguar Land Rover is a very deep one and a very long-standing one. I mean, probably slightly overstating to say, but you know, between the two companies, I think they pioneered the use of aluminium in automotive space. I mean, Jaguar Land Rover were the first and still probably the only company that have gone all in. You know, they decided at an early stage that they wanted a full aluminium architecture. So you know, largely chassis, body parts, pretty much as they can, they're making out of aluminium. That led them very quickly to look at the sustainability credentials of the material, to see, you know, if they're going to use that material, could they make it a more sustainable version of aluminium? And that led them very quickly into thinkings around you know, using more recycling, etc. So Novelis has had a long-standing relationship. It's underpinned by, you know, a very strong commercial relationship, and I think that's one thing everyone sort of glosses over in circular economy is you actually need a business and a financial. It needs to be sustainable, you know, and that's certainly been the case with the working of the companies. And we've done a number of different projects and innovations over the years with JLR that, again, in some ways have probably have led the industry in that area of thinking.
So they aren't the world's biggest recycler of aluminium just for fun, also because it turns a profit.
Yeah, no, I think Novelis did very well for themselves. But is profit a dirty word? Like Andy says, you have sustainable businesses still need to be sustainable. it's all well and good doing positive things, but if you run out of money and stop having to do with them, then... And I think like there is that interplay, because again, like businesses does exist, and like to have a thriving economy, even though it doesn't have to be growing, you do need to have businesses working within that to be creating wealth, to be creating those cascades of money and flows and thinking. So, and it is funny because so in the next, like when we talk about, go back to speaking to Andy in a sec, he just like everyone bilks it talking about money, and it's so true. I mean, I tried to talk to literally everyone about money, and Andy was the only one that even close to having a chat around money within a business sense. And I think that's really funny when you're talking about the circular economy, talking about economies. Economy is about money, yet no one likes to talk about it. It's like it becomes a very dirty word if you're doing something sustainable, or if you're doing something that's environmentally friendly. It's just like, oh, we make money. And like, you know, it's not a bad thing. It's what keeps, you know, people clothed and in houses and fed. Money isn't a bad thing. It's just when it becomes the be all and end all of a business, that's when it becomes an issue. But yeah, I was talking to Andy as well about like, yes, around this kind of idea of aluminium and the reality project and how it flows through the two businesses, because they're separate entities. So how does that work?
Yeah, that was part of the sort of strategic thinking, I think, from Jaguar's perspective when they started using aluminium. How do we make it more sustainable? I mean, clearly one of the things they want to do is minimise their own process waste. It's quite a high percentage, I'll be honest. In automotive, it's, you know, usually north of 40%, which is quite a high scrappage rate. Now, that's not just Jaguar, that's just industry standard. Obviously, their interest is in trying to reduce that number. But it's not a regular shape pattern that they're making. So you think about there's some complexity with that. So what we worked with them on, and it was initially called Real Car, Recycled Aluminium Car, project number 1, was how do you put a closed loop system together, and what are the consequences of that. So essentially coming out of Real Car 1, which was Innovate UK, as it was named something else at the time, but a UK government funded project, was this closed loop production system, and that's manifested in our system. We're sat here today in Warrington, and it takes place in the UK, related around the Warrington plant. So in very simple terms, we're taking press shop scrap as segregated as we can get it, and that depends on the press shops, the individual press shops, because they're all largely retrofitted with conveyor systems to manage scrap. Some of it's done by campaigns, so we'll know a particular press shop is using this particular alloy this week, and therefore we can keep that separate and have that as a separate alloy. So the automotive industry uses a number of different alloys. Jaguar use, I would say, 3 or 4 principal ones in the 5,000 and 6,000 series of alloys. So we, through our contractor partners, recover that material from the Jaguar press shops and their tier 1 partners. So pretty much everything that Jaguar produces in the UK, I think it's about 15 sites, is consolidated and brought into the Warrington site here. We're then remelting that, casting it to an ingot. So again, that alloy cleanliness is important, that segregation, to keep the efficiency of that as high as possible. And then that ingot is loaded onto a train in Widnes. We run a train as Novelis every day out of the UK through the Channel Tunnel into the rolling mill complex and the finishing complex. So to take an ingot, so a big slab, and automotive slabs are about 10 tons, to take that down to another sheet of aluminium that's going to go into a pressing line at Jaguar's workshop requires that after we've cast it, it's then heat, hot and cold rolled. So it's pressurized and rolled down to a thin sheet. We've got rolling mills in Germany and Switzerland that will do that. And then it needs, depending on its application in the car where it's going to be used, it will need a certain amount of what we would call finishing. So that's solution chemical heat treatment. So you're tempering it, you're etching it, you're using different elements to give to structural properties for the material. So the train leaves the UK, takes it into the first stage, drops in the ingot that's going into the rolling process, and we'll pick up work in progress, take that into the next factory where it will be finished, and that train is running back through the tunnel every day with finished goods into distribution warehouse in Daventry, and then that's supplied into the various press shops, and the cycle starts again. Okay. So that was I would say a pretty pretty good example of how you can make a circular system work. I guess in general terms, because if I start talking about money, people get nervous. But in very general terms as well, there was an alignment between the companies about how do we make this as affordable for all partners. And if you think about buying 100% of material, using say 60 and scrapping 40, you can do a certain amount of adjustment in your payment terms, where actually the ownership is not taking, essentially Jaguar wouldn't necessarily own 100% of the material all the time. It's actually, in payment terms, it's being financed through a different mechanism. So, we're not buying 100% and selling 100% and then buying back 40%. It's actually being financed through a payment terms mechanism where there's money flowing between the two companies. So there's a little bit of jiggery pokery in the finances that makes it a more, I'd say, financially sustainable system as well.
Jiggery pokery in the financial systems. It's all part of the problem, though, isn't it? I'm not going to go at Novelis and JLR, but it's interesting, isn't it? You start talking about money, and people do start feeling uncomfortable. And I think because it's complex, you could hear how complex that project was. Getting the aluminium segregated at all, did he say 15 different sites, and then getting that all together to get it melted down and then through over to the Channel Tunnel to get rolled and then brought back, and then all of the payment terms that go with it. And that's just one material between two businesses. And this is, I think, for me, this example became really, really interesting to understand the complexity around closing loops. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does. Is that loop much more complicated than if you just get a fresh batch of aluminium delivered to your door?
Yeah. You'd get aluminium from China in an ingot delivered.
So it starts at that ingot stage, basically, which was halfway through.
Yeah. You don't have to worry about composition. You just have to kind of worry about provenance. Where's it come from? And so it becomes really complex. And so I ended up, again, I was talking to Gail about it on how it's working from their end. Because you're talking about two different, one business is all about looking at the waste side of things and flowing it through to get it back to a product. The other one's about making a product and throwing the other bits away that then they're hoping to come back through, and then what happens to that product. So I had a chat to Gail about it.
It's really complex because the way that the scrap industry works, at least for cars, is that the cars are shredded and that's it. You get some fluff out of it, which is where you have all your textile and all your plastics end up. You have that ferrous fraction, which is all your steel-based scrap. And then you have the non-ferrous fraction. But potentially, if there is different markets for all those different types of scrap to be used, maybe there is a way forward for the metal recycling industry to revive the way they do their processes internally. Maybe they will start to say, okay, maybe we don't end up our processes here. Maybe we have to also include a segregation step where we can refine it a bit further so that it can be used for more applications. And that's where you have a market that is evolving, and you have new applications and new business opportunities for companies who have been just focusing on shredding and exporting material.
That's cool. So it really goes back to the circular there and the design of the manufacturing process and how that might change now that they're starting to consider recycling.
Yeah. And so it's this constant knock-on design effect. So it's just we've talking to Andy at Novelis, we have to think about how you get material from A to B through the tunnel, rolled out, back through into the right places so we can all go around the system again. But then actually, yes, if you're designing cars in a way to allow that to happen, then you have to design the factory slightly differently, and then you have to design, you have to be talking to people like Andy or the other scrap merchants about how to, and it's just whoa, the complexity keeps building.
But it's nice to hear that they're bought in enough to actually make changes to the manufacturing process and the car design. That's cool for me. It's not just an add-on. It's not just recycling. It's going further than that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think this is what I find so interesting about the automotive sector is they've just gone for it. on like every aspect of it. So if you're talking about recycling, circular economy, electric cars, like you do end up talking about what I do anyway, because I love the concept of transport as a service. So I was chatting to Gail about transport as a service and JLR's role in that.
Well, the automotive industry as a whole is starting to look into a future that is more automated and also electrified and shared. So yes, JLR has been working in that space already. And we have also partnered with Waymo to supply them with a few hundreds of Ibases for their autonomous share fleet in the US. So yes, we are working in that space. And also when we enter a world when we have cars that are used in that transport as a service model, we also need to understand that those cars will be used at a higher use than what personal vehicles are at the moment. Potentially, a car that can be used in a shared mobility fleet environment will be on the road constantly, which means that potentially its life will also shorten quite significantly. So those cars might have a life cycle of 4 years, which is a random number in comparison to a personal vehicle, which will stay on the road for about 12 to 15 years.
Oh, yeah.
So you will have cycles of vehicles that are much shorter. So newer cars will be hitting the scrapyards. And, well, we need to understand also what we do with them. If we remanufacture them, if we recycle the materials in them, if we repurpose the batteries for another use. So there are also lots of opportunities around transportation as a model to understand for a service world what that means and how could we get more value out of those assets as well.
This blew my mind. And so you might have heard in the clip there, I go, oh,
I was going to say, so a little bit behind the scenes of podcast making and interviewing. I've told you this, Tom. You're not supposed to reply because then we can't cut you out of it as easy. But you did, and I guess that's because you were so excited about it.
Yeah, and I could, and it's amazing, like, because, yeah, like, I love this idea of transport as a service and, like, kind of automotive car, like, autonomous cars driving around. And at no point in that whole talking, probably for the last, like, 2.5 years, maybe even longer, has anyone said, yeah, but, you know, if the cars are on the road more, they're going to burn through cars a lot quicker. We're going to have more cars hitting scrapyards quicker. Like,
but fewer cars on the road, so maybe it evens out.
But what about that bit in the middle where we've got loads of cars that are like 10 years old hitting scrapyards, and then you've got cars that have been on the road for 3 years as autonomous cars? You're going to get to this point where it just smacks in. And who's talking about that? And you can listen me talking to Gail, going like, what? This is amazing. Like, yes, I've never thought about this before. Like, how have I never thought about this? And then we got into a bit of a chat about it. I was like, this is amazing. And it's not just like kind of the tires or it's all the little bits that go with it. So we carried on talking about it. It was like, yeah, blew my mind.
That's where the big shifts happen for the automotive industry, because you have to redesign your vehicles and understand how to loop in the fact that you will have more and more usage for the car. For example, you have a door being slammed maybe 20 times more than what it used to be in the past. So we also have to ensure that our standards and our requirements and our tests also take that in account. So the way we design cars might also change in the future.
So we carried on talking, and it was like this, oh, amazing. So like, at the moment, you're in a car and you're the driver and you're driving along and you get out the car, you get back into the car, it's the driver's door that takes the hammer. Whereas in self-driving cars, it's every door that then starts taking that extra wear and tear. And that's really interesting because this was not an issue that they've ever had before of the back door being open and closed more than a front door.
It is interesting. Are we going to start designing more for wear and tear then and less about looks as well? If people aren't really buying their own cars and they're using cars as a service, maybe that becomes more utilitarian design.
Yeah. Like,
I don't know. Interesting how it would affect the looks of cars and everything.
Yeah, because it doesn't become this, it's not a symbol anymore. And it's not, like I'm one of these people that loves a red sports car. Or no, I prefer my 4x4 big thing. God,
that was a type of car.
4x4 big thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Or whatever, like the luxury cars in the middle. It's just like, oh, you know what? I just get into this perfectly designed vehicle to move people around efficiently and effectively. And that's wonderful. Like, and I'd never, ever thought about that. Whenever I thought about it, it was just transport as a service. It was all the cars that we have now driving around for 10 years. But no, it's specially designed cars to be those type of vehicles for a shorter amount of time. I was like, even now, like, and this is go back to what Ian says, like talking about the circular economy puts a smile on your face. Like, I'm smiling talking about it because that's really interesting. Everyone's looking at me like I'm insane, but no, like, I found it really. No, I found it just mind-boggling. It was beautiful to be in that room with Gail. It was just lovely.
I like hearing about it from Gail because they're the car manufacturer, but they're considering this sort of thing already, so they know that the industry is going to change.
Yeah, and I think they know it's going to change, and they're talking with people that they would never have thought about talking to 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Like, would a car company talk to a search engine company? Well, that's what they're doing by talking to Google, Waymo. And it's just those partnerships that have come out of it.
It has to be an additional source of revenue for JLR for the time being to understand how that develops in the future. But yes, that's certainly the reason behind it, because there is a new market segment happening with service companies that wants to have that transport service in place. So that's where partnership with companies like Waymo comes into play, because we want to be sure that we are also understanding how that works and potentially having more of an impact on this in the future.
Yeah, I love the fact that there's a lot more collaboration going on. Again, I don't know if that's the case. It's just, that's how I feel about it. Like, and that's what a lot of people are saying. There seems to be a lot more collaboration going on because they're trying to solve problems that they have no expertise in. So Jaguar Land Rover are trying to solve problems around recycling aluminium. Thankfully, they weren't arrogant enough to be like, do you know what, we're smart, we'll figure this out. They went and talked to someone about it, and they were like, oh, how do we solve the problem around this new way of using cars? Like, we don't know anything about data and AI. Let's go and talk to someone that does. Let's go and talk to Waymo. That just accelerates this growth, and that's what's happening in the automotive industry that I find so exciting, like really, really exciting. But like we talked about in the first episode, is it all good? I asked Gail if there were going to be, who are the biggest winners for this?
To answer this, I would say that the biggest winners potentially will be the end consumer, which is the people that would probably use that service, because they will be able to access vehicles without having the burden of needing to own those vehicles in the first place. So potentially just by hailing JLR vehicle on the road with the Waymo service, people will be able to get from point A to B much easier without having to think about where to park and how much that costs them to keep that car in their potential assets. In terms of benefits also for the whole value chain, I think that is quite consistent with what I said before, because a company like JLR would see additional revenue stream from that, and with further control of our value chain and the supply chain in the future, once those cars are decommissioned, potentially they can be used as resources for us to look back in and produce JLR vehicles, either with the repurposing of the battery or even reusing the aluminium that we can take back, working in partnership with the waste industry. That's where the value is as well for JLR. And then before that, you have all our Tier 1 partners, the metal suppliers and the waste industry that can also benefit from being in that loop, because that's another type of business that isn't there currently, because the waste industry is currently seen as the end of the loop, but it has the potential in the future to become more of an active stakeholder in that full circular loop if we happen to do that in the future. And I think that's needed.
It all sounds perfect. Really, really perfect. You're going to have these car manufacturers that are giving their offcuts to aluminium smelters to turn back into more sheet to go back into the car, to et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have these cars that no one's going to own apart from Jaguar Land Rover that you'll be able to access. And then once that car comes to end of life, it's been designed in such a way that it gets taken apart. And it's just like, oh yeah, solved it. It's great. But again, like in that first episode, you have to scratch the surface a little bit. I started thinking around more about, if you have this idea of extended transport fleet around the UK, that'll have to be probably just one system. So like if I wanted to get, so we're in Manchester at the moment, if I wanted to use one of these transport as a service vehicles to get down to London, to make that as efficient as possible, they'd have to work in Manchester and London. So you wouldn't be able to have that competition there. So then you're talking about actually you're just having like Waymo, this one taxi service basically, and then you've got this one car company that controls all these assets. Like that's a very powerful, I don't know the word.
It is. Well, there's no competition, and which is always dangerous. And I worry about in this scenario where no one's owning a car anymore, you're constantly paying towards either taxi services or the rental of a car. That's a monthly payment that's got to continuously be kept up. And I know there's always monthly payments with cars if you think of insurance and tax, etc., and petrol. But I know people who have never paid for a car but have cars. They've been handed it by family members. It's been a really rubbish old car, and there will definitely be costs attached to that, like fixing it quite regularly, but you haven't had to ever shell out for a car. You're not paying monthly payments for a car. So I guess, especially when we're talking about competition and there's no competition, we're going to have to make sure that those monthly payments are affordable for people and add up to a realistic price that works for everybody and is inclusive.
Yeah, and I think that's this kind of well-being we talked about and Ken talks about. We need to make sure it's accessible for everyone, abundant and regenerative. Make sure that it adds value to everybody that it interacts with. And I think that's really interesting. And one of the questions I was talking to Gail about as well is around like, why are we shredding cars? And actually it came down to the fact that taking a car apart is really hard, like to do it well. And actually it's just not worth it because it's so cheap to get the raw material that is aluminium. And it just sounds bonkers to me that here in the UK, it's cheaper to get another nation to extract bauxite and go through all that process than it is to take a car apart and give it back to someone else. So I asked Ken about it. Why is it cheaper?
I'm a bit of a fan of understanding aluminium cycles, so you're playing to something I enjoy here, Tom. So Jaguar Land Rover wouldn't have so much of a problem if they retained, sounds simple, but if they retained control of the vehicles. Because the thing is, it goes into third parties' hands, it goes into customers' hands. You don't know where it is and when and if it would come back, and it won't come back in a controlled way very often. So this is another element about product service systems, that you can get this material back and you can design it to be returned if you're controlling the use of it much more from creating it to when it ends its first use period, if you want to put it that way. That's one thing. But there's another thing, is that once it gets into third parties' hands, it often gets contaminated. Unless it's returned directly to the factory in the way it was, all aluminium is an alloy, and it doesn't take much to throw that off in terms of you get a mix, a downcycled sort of mix of aluminium, which is not that useful to the car manufacturers. They'd rather have a very much known alloy. They have to have a known alloy to do all the stress tests and the quality and all the rest of it. They have to have that. And so they'd rather pay premium on a new aluminium sheet than one that's made out of recycled material, partly because they worry about contamination. And even if there isn't contamination in it, there is often the question about whether there's enough of the right quality to come back to them. I looked at that, but one of the big things about recycling is that we get, with aluminium, we keep forgetting it's all alloy. Even aluminium cans are two different types of alloy. The one's on the tops and the one on the side. It's different. So you need different qualities of aluminium, and if you just put it all into one recycling thing and try to smelt it down, you can only use it for certain uses. You can only make use of it for certain products. And this was known way back in World War II. In Britain, we had this thing about, if you hand in your aluminium pots and pans, which were then largely reserved for the middle class and above, I have to say, we'll make Spitfires out of it for the war. Well, they couldn't make Spitfires out of it. It wasn't enough. It wasn't the right quality to stick in a Merlin engine. And so this was more, let's say it's a good thing without really thinking it through. And it's the same with many of these aluminium can things. They're only really good for aluminium cans. The other element of this bauxite question is that huge amounts of aluminium goes into infrastructure. bridges, but offices, all sorts of stuff uses aluminium, and it doesn't come out of that infrastructure for 70 years. And so while infrastructure keeps growing, while people keep building bigger cities and reworking their cities, they're going to be attracted to have a lot more because they need it, because the infrastructure's not shedding its aluminium for 70 years. So until the infrastructure stops growing, you're going to have a demand for new aluminium coming in, and it's going to get locked away for a long period of time. And at the same time, with subsidies for energy and the huge scale which bauxite and aluminium smelters work on, they're very keen to make sure that whole sausage machine of making aluminium, if you like, the whole production line keeps running. And so they're not going to be very interested in slowing it down because it ups their costs quite markedly. And so they want to keep finding markets for it and be very, very, very competitive indeed. And if the subsidies on the fuel are there, and there's an encouragement for other export subsidies, let's imagine, you can see why good quality new aluminium is so attractive to so many uses. And for things like aircraft, you just cannot use recycled stuff at all because it's so specialist. You can get it back from other airplanes, but you can't make your average post-consumer waste use of it. Even Apple, last point, Apple have boasted about doing one of their laptops with recovered aluminium. It's pre-consumer waste. In other words, it's top quality shavings and stuff that's within the aluminium business. It's never gone to a consumer. That's gathered up and processed, as they always do anyway, but made available in this case for Apple. So yes, it is recycling, but it's pre-consumer waste. It's not really a wonder. It's not a wonderful thing. The main problems are then, just to summarize, contamination with aluminium, reliable supply, and the fact that so much aluminium goes into infrastructure, and that all aluminium is an alloy. So you can't just talk about pure aluminium. There's always something in it to give it the qualities that the customers need. It's notionally fully recyclable, but to do what?
I don't know what I should have taken from that, but I'm thinking that we should just cancel aluminium.
Cancel aluminium?
Just cancel it. It sounds like it's takes a lot of energy to make. I know we need it for airplanes, but cancel them as well, right? I don't know. I'm now I've got a downer on aluminium just generally.
So I don't think it's aluminium that's the problem. I think there's just a lot of embedded processes. Like Ken was just saying in there as well, kind of the greenwashing that happened during the Second World War around aluminium and the pans, middle-class pans not being used for Merlin engines. And I think this idea of actually Jaguar Land Rover owning that asset to make it easier, the entire process. So if it goes into consumers' hands, you don't know the quality work you're going to get back. I think at the moment that's kind of like what the scrap dealers are like as well. You put a Jaguar Land Rover in there and it just gets turned into, it's just a mix of stuff. So you really have to look after it. Ken and I continue talking about this a bit as well.
It's just the parameters they've got for making full use of that at a reasonable cost. Because the thing I missed out saying was any recycling takes more people handling than mass production of the raw material does. Mass production is very capital intensive. There's always a lot more labor involved in recovery and recycling, which has to be paid for somewhere. Then we're back to the tax system. We give subsidies for capital and mass production, and we charge people taxes to be workers. So that doesn't help, you have to admit.
I think I can admit that. I don't think it does help. And when Ken told me this, again, it was kind of like with Gail, it was just like this, my head just kind of blew up. It was just like, yeah, why do we tax people to work? Why is labour taxed? Why do I get taxed? It was an interesting comment. I mean, it seems really as in, I've always paid tax. I actually don't have a problem with tax, but it is just like the thing that you're trying to do with work is trying to get some money to live and support yourself and to kind of et cetera, et cetera. And then you bring in automation into any industry, or you're trying to create much more efficient, effective systems, which doesn't get taxed. Governments are willfully working through this place where they're going to end up having less money to spend, as well as people having less money to spend. So the government are going to have to support people more just so that we can create more stuff quicker.
But how do you tax nothing?
I know. Like it was really interesting time. Like as in I couldn't, I still struggle to get my head around it a little bit.
It is something I've never thought of before, and it is really interesting. Yeah, you're losing out on people taxes if people are not there anymore.
Yeah.
But how do you tax the absence of people?
Well, it's like what Ken was saying earlier about incentives as well. Why are these organisations getting incentives to work towards this so that they get less people in work, gaining more tax? But then Ian in the last episode was saying that the circular economy will improve the amount of people in work. So I'm getting a bit lost. As in, like, is it good for people? Is it good for countries? Is it good for whoever? And I think this is these interplays that happen within the circular economy when you start thinking about it and start scratching under that surface. You start going, kept on talking to Ken about these incentives and where do we see them, when do we find them, and why is that a problem?
A lot of it's done because they feel that the impact on energy use by certain parts of the population would be damaging. Well, yes, because the infrastructure hasn't been invested in to make sure that the houses are properly fitted out to cope, whether it's with heat or cold. They don't have the public transport net. They don't have a sophisticated infrastructure. So it's meant to be protecting some segments of society who would get decidedly twitchy if they were paying a lot more for energy. But beyond that, it's a whole set of reasons. If you want large-scale agriculture, it's built on pumping oil into it, oil and fertilizers in effect. You've got lots and lots of production areas which can only work at a large scale and work globally because fuel is effectively subsidized. It isn't paying the real cost. And that is a real threat to many people. If they're trying to run a global soybean operation, they don't want costs piling up because their tractors take more energy, the fertilizers cost more to make, and delivering it to the market has gone up. That's part of it. Is an expression of power, and those people clearly don't want the rules of the game to change to make it advantageous to grow things more regionally or locally, or without many fossil fuels. Why they're not going to vote for that? Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Now there's a power layer to this, but the thing is that the IMF's done good things by trying to actually catalogue the real, or more of the real broad cost of these subsidies. And they're way, way ahead of anything that's ever paid to renewables. And that's a sort of madness, of course.
But I guess this goes back to, there's incentivization, which is quite direct. There's indirect incentivization of the taxing situation that we just talked about. But then also there's other players who are directly working against this. So I recently have been working with the Restart project, and we've been talking about right to repair, and they're lobbying for people being able to repair their tech devices. Yeah. But on the flip side, there's other lobbying groups from organisations that you can imagine arguing against the right to repair. And my first thought was, what would that argument even look like? How would you say, no, consumers shouldn't be able to repair their stuff? Well, they're using things like health and safety to get around it. But those groups are lobbying groups on behalf of the tech industry, and that's just the line that they're using to win their argument. So there's always actors on the other side of things.
No, and I think it's just this power imbalance that's really interesting, that again, like, no one ever talks about in the circular economy, like this idea of moving from a linear to a circular economy. It's really interesting because then once you start talking about power and money and influence, then you realise that actually, who is pulling the strings? Like, who is working towards different things? Who are the actors behind the curtain? And I went back to Ken and I was just like, why do we incentivise the fossil fuel industry?
Well, you have to include all the costs in it. Just take the fossil fuel business. The IMF calculates the real costs, the real value in subsidies for the fossil fuel industry in 2017 were around 6.5% of global GDP, which is absolutely huge. We're talking something like $5 trillion, trillion, not billion. And this includes some of the costs for health, for loss of life, for direct subsidies, indirect subsidies, cleaning up the mess afterwards, some elements of the climate emergency. So the real the real costs of fossil fuel energy would be huge if the full costs were integrated. But how can we make a rational decision about using oil and coal and whatever if we don't feel the real costs of it? You know, if your flight from Bristol to Stockholm was now twice as much because the airline had to pay the real costs of fossil fuel, you'd make a lot different decisions about how you got there. You might do a Greta Thunberg and decide I'm going to spend over a day and go on the train, just to make it playful. But you'd make different decisions, you see. You'd be keen on, I'm part of a car sharing club here in Devon. That's great because you can get utilization, you can get access to a vehicle. You didn't have to be your own. But I haven't given up my car yet. And so if I started realizing that it was really, really expensive to use my own vehicle, my move towards this other form of transport would just be accelerated. That's what the shift does. It just accelerates the rate at which change happens. Because at the moment, you're saying markets matter, but you're not wanting to include the full cost in the market. So I don't know how that squares up.
I think it is mad that fossil fuels get more incentives than renewables. And this idea that Ken was saying earlier as well about this capital intensive. So like recycling needs more labour and it's taxed at labour, and then capital you get an investment to build that. So you get basically create these mining operations, and you get these negative for recycling. So since I was talking to an aluminium smelter, since I was talking to Andy, I thought I'd ask him about that as well.
I think we are relatively capital intensive as well. I mean, this site in Warrington, as I said earlier on, supplies a rolling mill. That's the world's largest rolling mill. It's I don't know how many billion-dollar asset it would be. It's a joint venture with another aluminium company. It's been there. It does over 1.5 million tons. It's a huge site, and there are tens of millions of pounds. For example, we opened the world's largest recycling centre in Nachterstedt in Germany in 2014 at a cost of $250 million US. So maybe in comparison to some of the mining business, that isn't big bucks, but it's not like in crude terms, it's not like a plastics recycler. You can probably set up with a few tens of thousands here and extrude pellets and become a recycler. So there are barriers to entry related to the size of the industry here. Coming to sort of what sort of incentives. I mean, it's not. Again, you'll probably see on the site there's not a huge number of employees here, but I guess in the value chain there is. Coming back to your point, I guess one of our asks is around energy. Okay, everyone comes back to the use of energy and the cost of energy. It's pretty well known that if you recycle aluminium, you're saving 95% of the energy, which is where the huge CO2 savings as well come from. But if you look at consuming energy in European marketplace, we're paying quite high prices for energy. We're CO2 taxed as well. We're in the EU emissions trading scheme, and does that put the company in a European context at a disadvantage with a non-ETS taxed or a non-carbon taxed area, or an area that's got maybe artificially low energy prices? So it's probably not a very straight answer to the question, but if you look at the costs of production of primary aluminium, a lot of it is below cost price. So it's politically managed by China. Okay, so that's been the case for a number of years. I'd say in primary production, just generally, we're probably not factoring in all of the externalities, all of the environmental consequences of that. Although, as I said, ASI is a very good system that's going to address some of those. But if we produce something in China as a society, it's then recycled in Europe because, I don't know, it's a TV or some electronics good, and then it's recycled here. We're paying European prices to recycle it, and we're taxed on top of it for carbon emissions, etc. It seems to be a disincentive to do the right thing. You might just say, "Oh, why should we do that? Why don't we just keep taking the cheap material from Asia?" So having affordable energy pricing, constant energy pricing, why would you put a good industry like recycling in an emissions trading scheme at all? We're the good guys. We're trying to do good things. Why? If you're producing other materials that are energy embedded, energy intensive, then maybe you need it. Maybe for aviation, all these other things that are in there, that's needed as a disincentive to consumption. To tax the carbon that's being consumed. But for an industry that's actually based in a market where the material arises at end of life, that's trying to do something with it, why have we got the same level of taxation, crudely speaking? Albeit that we've got a much less energy consumption than the primary business, but albeit that we're still being taxed in this market. So our request, one of the things to start to think about is, do we actually need that? It's not necessarily an incentive, but it's to take away the current disincentive.
Like so many different parts of this episode about talking to people, like this blew my mind as well. It's like this idea that in Europe, organisations like Novelis that are recycling use a lot of energy to go through that process of recycling. Because they use that energy, they get taxed.
Right, but that energy in this instance will in the long run save energy. But that's not being taken into account.
Yeah, whereas the nations, the states that are creating it don't have any of those taxes on their energy uses.
So it gets even more complicated. So the people who are creating aluminium rather than recycling it are not getting taxed because of where they are in the world.
And then because it's like Andy was saying there, like it's political, the government in China artificially reduces the price of raw aluminium. So it's like, what? It's a really murky world. And then that's when you start realizing that like it's this power imbalance is there. You're never going to find yourself in a situation where we get to a circular economy. So at the end of the first series, I was just like, it'll happen. The circular economy will just happen. One day you'll just turn around and we'll be in the circular economy. But everything like I've been talking to like Andy about and to Ken about and to Gail about and everyone about, actually we need real intervention to push it towards a circular economy because there's so much power imbalance in the system that people don't want that to change. And that's what's fascinating. That's really interesting because no one ever talks about that. Like the circular economy is just what's going to happen. No one talks about like, actually we need to drag this into existence and face these political, powerful, rich actors that don't want it to happen.
Next time on Tech for Good Live and the circular economy, we look at the future of the circular economy and how we purposely can use it to make positive social change. This podcast wouldn't exist without Tom Passmore and Sophie Walker from Disposal. Music has been graciously provided by George Fell. Podcast.co make all of this possible thanks to the shiny podcast studio they provide. I've been and will continue to be Rebecca Ray Evans. Thanks also to Paul Jakubowski and Johnny Ray Evans from the Tech for Good Live team. If you're interested in learning more about the circular economy, then why not listen to the LWARB Circular Economy podcast?